The jukebox was the cornerstone of diners, bars, pizza parlors, and other social gathering places in the mid-20th century, a mechanical marvel that helped facilitate the rise of rock and roll. For many, it was the source of musical entertainment and enjoyment, but for some, it was an unwanted source of noise, when they would rather have a few minutes of peace and quiet, even if they had to pay for it. Paying for silence by the minute may seem like something from a dystopian future, but it was actually going on before most people who were watching this were even born. In November 1944, Billboard magazine reported that a judge in Richmond, Virginia carries with him a sign which reads "Out of Order" and which is hung on the jukebox as the judge sits down. He removes the placard when he leaves, depositing various sums to compensate for the loss so that others may have music with their meals. It's a reasonable fee for peace and quiet, he rules. The idea of paying for silence caught on, and in April 1945, Gracie Allen wrote in her newspaper article,
"I've just read about the most wonderful invention since the telephone. It's a jukebox into which you drop a coin and buy 3 minutes of silence instead of jump and jive. Now, if the scientists can just figure out how to do that with human beings..."
Why 3 minutes of silence? That's because the typical length of the 78 RPM records that jukeboxes were playing back then was between 2.5 and 3.5 minutes. For example, Let's Dance by Benny Goodman from 1939, 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Take the A-Train by Glenn Miller from 1941, 3 minutes and 25 seconds. What Is This Thing Called Love by Tommy Dorsey from 1942, 2 minutes and 51 seconds. And One for My Baby by Johnny Mercer from 1943, 3 minutes and 6 seconds. By the 1950s, the phenomenon had become international. In July 1953, the Chicago Herald-American reported that a British jukebox firm had one of their selector panels labeled Silence. For the price of one play, the customer can buy himself a record that just spins silently. All models turned out by the firm will include a 3-minute silence space. Of course, it's impossible to make a totally silent record. The friction of the needle in the groove is always going to cause a little bit of surface noise, but compared to the volume of the music, it's still going to be quiet enough to serve the intended effect. If the concept of a few minutes of silence that aren't totally silent due to unintentional background noise sounds familiar, you're right. These silent jukebox records are cited as one of the inspirations for John Cage's famous composition 433. Most of these silent records had very plain labels because they were merely functional. They didn't need to be adorned with the same kind of artwork as commercial releases. But in 1959, two students at the University of Detroit decided to create a record label they called Hush when they installed a few silent records on the campus's jukebox. They made up humorous titles and artists for these silent records, such as Silence to Chit Chat by, Silence for Deep Conversation, Quiet for Study, and Shh, Go Away. Those silent discs in the jukebox were played so often that they had to be replaced when they wore out and developed noisy scratches. And the students also pressed 400 copies of those silent records and sold them for $4 apiece, raising $1,600 towards a new wing on the Student Union building. That same year, the topic of silent jukebox records was even mentioned in a congressional hearing. Congressman John Lindsay of New York commented, "You go into a diner these days and you are subjected to all sorts of music you would rather not hear." And Hammond Chaffetz, a lawyer representing jukebox manufacturers, responded, "That is my point. You are subjected to it. As a matter of fact, somebody was unkind enough to come up with a record a few years ago which, for a nickel, would give you 3 minutes of silence if you didn't want the music." He called it unkind because the music industry doesn't make any money if a jukebox is used to play something that isn't music, so they rather have you play the song called The Sound of Silence than the actual sound of silence. A silent record may also cause some people to think the jukebox is broken if they see it playing a record but no sound is coming out. As a result, some of these silent records actually had a periodic beep recorded on them. And speaking of beeps, one fan of silent records is electronic musician Brian Eno, who mentioned it in a lecture he gave in 2003.
Actually, in the 1950s, I heard there used to be jukeboxes in America that had a one-silent disc on. So if you wanted a bit of peace, you put your dime in and dialed up that number, and you got 3 minutes of silence. I'd love to get a collection of those records. A jukebox where that's all you had. Different varieties of silence.
And in a bizarre coincidence, Jeremy Clarkson also mentioned silent records in the context of complaining about Brian Eno's most famous composition as an unwanted source of noise.
Did you know, for instance, that Microsoft employed Brian Eno to write the 4-note chime when you turn on a Windows 95 computer? Why? I know when the sodding thing comes on because when I push the buttons on the keyboard, words appear on the screen. I do not need an audible alert, nor do I need the car to chirp when I lock it. Oh, and publicans, if you have a jukebox on the premises, here's an idea. Why not allow customers to buy 3 minutes of silence?
But these silent records weren't so popular with everybody. The students of the University of Colorado in Boulder rejected the idea twice. The first time it was considered to be a gag, and the disc was only played once. They tried it again a year later, but the silent record was removed after 99.5% of the patrons said they wanted music with their coffee. 99.5%? Who did that poll? Fox News? When jukeboxes were taken out of service and replaced with other noise-making devices like arcade games and big-screen TVs, nobody considered these silent records to be worth saving.
Ow. Ooh.
And probably most of them have totally blank labels, so if a collector did come across one of them today and played it expecting to hear some long-lost song, instead they just hear silence and not know what the point of it is and discard the record as worthless. Luckily, I was able to find one on eBay which did have a label saying 3 minutes silence. It came from a seller in Wales, which is why it has the small center hole. It has grooves on both sides, so if you put this in a jukebox, you'd have 2 selections that play 3 minutes of silence. If you have any memories of these silent jukebox records, let me know in the comments. But in the meantime, I'll leave you with this one serving its intended purpose of providing 3 minutes of silence, except for a little bit of groove noise, and it won't even cost you a dime.